The letter fell from Cora Sawyer's trembling fingers and fluttered to the warped porch boards like a dying bird, and she stared down at Thomas Redmond with eyes that had gone cold as January creek water. "You read it," she said. The words came out quiet, which was worse than shouting. "You stood right here on my porch every single morning for 4 months, Thomas Redmond, and you read every letter that came through this town about me." Thomas stood at the bottom of her porch steps, his deputy's badge catching the hard morning light, his jaw tight as a drawn bowstring. He did not deny it. He could not deny it, because the evidence was laid out between them as plainly as a body at a funeral. The postmaster, old Gerald Finch, had let it slip to the widow Haverson over Sunday supper, and the widow Haverson had a mouth that could carry news faster than the telegraph wire. "Cora, you knew," she said, her voice cracking on the single syllable. "You knew my brother was coming. You knew he was wanted. You knew the marshal from Abilene had written to warn me, and you never said a single word." She pressed one hand flat against the porch post to keep herself upright, because her knees had turned to water and her heart was doing something wild and painful inside her chest. "And you kept delivering my mail every morning like it was nothing, like I was nothing. That was the betrayal. Not that he was a deputy doing his job. Not even that he had read her private correspondence, though God knew that was bad enough. The betrayal was that he had looked her in the eyes morning after morning, handed her those envelopes with his calloused hands, and smiled at her like she was the first good thing he had seen all day, and never once told her what he knew. She had started to love him. That was the part that made her chest feel like it had been split open with a hatchet. She had started to love him, and he had been keeping secrets that could have gotten her killed. Thomas Redmond took one slow step up toward the porch, and the old wood groaned under his boot, and Cora backed up 2 steps until her shoulders hit the front door of the only home she had managed to build for herself in the 6 years since she had arrived in Harlan's Creek, Kansas, with $2, a small trunk, and the fierce, desperate belief that she could make something of herself in a place where no one knew her name. "Let me explain," he said. "I gave you 4 months of mornings," she said. "You had your chance to explain." She went inside and shut the door, and the click of the latch was the loneliest sound Thomas Redmond had ever heard in his life. It had started in the early spring of 1881, when the mud from the winter thaw was still sucking at the boots of everyone who walked down Main Street in Harlan's Creek, and the town was waking up slow and reluctant from the cold months like a bear coming out of a cave. Cora Sawyer had been in Harlan's Creek for 6 years by then, which made her one of the longer-standing residents, a fact that mattered in a frontier town where people came and went like tumbleweeds. She had arrived in 1875, 22 years old, with her $2 and her trunk, fleeing a situation back in Missouri that she never discussed with anyone, not even the women she had grown to call friends. She had taken a job at the Harlan's Creek schoolhouse, teaching the children of farmers and merchants, and a handful of the Cherokee families who had settled in the region, and she had been quietly ferocious about it, because teaching children was the one thing that felt entirely her own and entirely good. She had built herself a small house on the eastern edge of town, a neat 2-room structure with a porch that caught the afternoon sun, and she had planted a kitchen garden behind it, and she had become, in the slow accumulating way of small towns, someone that people trusted. She was not wealthy. She was not connected. But she was capable and steady, and in Harlan's Creek in 1881, those qualities were worth more than gold most days. She was also, though she would not have said so herself, quietly lonely in the way that capable and steady people often are, because everyone assumes they are fine and no one thinks to check. Thomas Redmond had arrived in Harlan's Creek in the fall of 1880, appointed deputy under Sheriff Cal Briggs, who was a decent man but getting older and slower, and needed someone reliable at his side. Thomas was 28, broad-shouldered, with dark brown hair that needed cutting and gray eyes that were serious most of the time and unexpectedly warm the rest. He had come from Dodge City, where he had served under a marshal who had taught him that law enforcement done right was mostly about preventing harm before it happened rather than cleaning up the mess afterward. He believed that. He tried to live by it, though the frontier tested that belief regularly. He had a dark past the way most men who ended up in frontier law enforcement did, meaning there were things he had done and things that had been done to him that he carried quietly, without complaint, because complaining about it would not change any of it, and he had long since made his peace with that arrangement. The mail route in Harlan's Creek was handled by the post office, which occupied a cramped corner of Gerald Finch's general store, and the daily distribution to the outlying residents was done by whoever Gerald could press into service that morning, which was usually a rotating cast of young men from the town who needed a few extra cents. The route did not include Cora Sawyer's house on the eastern edge, because she was considered close enough to the post office to collect her own mail, and for years she had done exactly that on her way to and from the schoolhouse. Thomas Redmond first left mail on Cora Sawyer's porch on a Tuesday morning in March of 1881, and it was entirely an accident. He had been riding the eastern road on his morning patrol, which took him past her house at the hour when the light was just starting to turn gold, and the birds were making their earliest tentative sounds, and he had found a packet of letters sitting in the mud at the base of her gate, where they had apparently fallen from the postal wagon the previous afternoon. He had gathered them up, ridden to her porch, and left them where she would find them, because it was the right thing to do and because he was constitutionally incapable of not doing the right thing when the right thing was obvious. He had not knocked. He had not announced himself. He had simply left the letters and ridden on. But on his way back down Main Street an hour later, he had passed Cora Sawyer heading to the schoolhouse, and she had been looking down at the envelopes in her hand with a small private smile that he had not been able to stop thinking about for the rest of the day. It was the kind of smile people have when they are alone and something has genuinely pleased them, before their face remembers to be careful. He had thought about it through his whole evening patrol. He had thought about it while cleaning his Colt Model 1873, which was his habit in the evenings, methodical and meditative. He had thought about it while eating the supper he made for himself in the back room of the sheriff's office, where he slept on a cot that was better than nothing, and not much more than that. By the next morning he had told himself firmly that he was not going to ride past her house on his patrol, because that would be making a detour that served no law enforcement purpose whatsoever, and he was a professional man. He rode past her house at exactly the same time as the day before. There was no mail to deliver. He had nothing to leave. He simply rode past, slow enough to notice that her kitchen garden had been freshly turned, that the wooden shutter on the east-facing window was in need of a new pin, that she had left a pair of her boots on the porch railing, probably to dry after the mud of the previous day. He kept riding, because he was not a man who lingered or mooned around. He had work to do. He did the work. But the next morning, when he stopped by Gerald Finch's store to pick up a supply order for the sheriff's office, he noticed a small stack of letters behind the counter addressed to Miss Cora Sawyer, and he looked at Gerald Finch and said, "I'll take those out to her. I'm riding that way." He was not riding that way. He altered his route to be riding that way. It was a small dishonesty, the kind a person commits so often and so automatically that they have usually stopped recognizing it as dishonesty. But Thomas Redmond noticed it in himself, and he filed it away, and he did not examine it too closely because he suspected that what he would find if he did was something that would complicate his life considerably. He left the letters on her porch. He did not knock. She was not home, having already left for the schoolhouse. The morning was cool and smelled of fresh earth, and her kitchen garden was beginning to show the first green suggestions of new growth, and he stood on her porch for approximately 30 seconds longer than was necessary before getting back on his horse and continuing on with his day. He was back the next morning, and the morning after that. By the second week of it, It had become a habit so established that it felt like something that had always been true, like the direction rivers run and the way the sun moves across the sky. He would stop at Gerald Finch's store, collect whatever mail had come in for Miss Sawyer, ride out to her place on the Eastern Road, and leave it on her porch. Sometimes she was home when he arrived. The first time she opened the door while he was still on the porch steps, she had looked at him with sharp, intelligent eyes and said, "Deputy Redmond, I didn't know my house was on the postal route." "It isn't," he had said, which was the most honest thing he could have said, and also, he immediately realized, the most revealing. She had looked at him for a long moment, and the look had in it both wariness and something else, something warmer that she was working to keep under control. "That's kind of you," she had said finally. "Would you like coffee?" He had accepted. He had told himself he was being neighborly, and that it was good community relations for a deputy to have a friendly relationship with the local schoolteacher, which was true enough on its surface. He had sat at her kitchen table and drunk her coffee, which was strong and hot and excellent, and they had talked about the town, about the students she was teaching, about the difficulty of getting decent school supplies from back east when the supply wagons were unreliable and the budget was always thin. She was, he discovered immediately, one of the most interesting people he had ever talked to. She had opinions that were precise and well-reasoned. She had a way of asking questions that made clear she actually wanted the answer. She was funny in a dry, understated way that you could miss if you were not paying attention, and he was paying attention. He was paying very close attention to everything about Cora Sawyer from the first morning she opened her door to him, and he knew it, and he did not know what to do with it. He began to look forward to mornings in a way he never had before. He was not a man who had done much looking forward to things. His life before Harlan's Creek had been characterized by a kind of steady forward motion, one foot in front of the other, getting through, which was different from anticipation and very different from joy. But these mornings, riding east on the Golden Road with a packet of letters in his hand, felt like something he had not realized he was missing until he found it. Cora, for her part, began to notice that she was waking up earlier. She had always been an early riser out of necessity, because the schoolhouse required her to be there before the students, and preparation took time. But now she was waking earlier than that, moving through her small house with a quiet alertness, putting the coffee on the stove, and then going to sit at the kitchen table with a book she was not really reading, listening for the sound of hooves on the Eastern Road. She told herself she was simply grateful for the convenience. She told herself it was practical to have her mail delivered rather than stopping at Gerald Finch's crowded store every day. She told herself that Thomas Redmond was a perfectly pleasant man, and that talking to him in the mornings was a perfectly innocent habit with no particular weight to it. She was a woman who had taught herself, over many years and through some considerable pain, to be honest about things, and she knew she was lying to herself. She had noticed Thomas Redmond the same fall he had arrived in Harlan's Creek. It was difficult not to notice him. He had a kind of quiet presence that took up more space than his actual physical form, a stillness and seriousness that was different from the loud, brittle confidence of most of the men who came through frontier towns. He did his job without making a performance of it. He was decent to people, including people the town generally considered beneath decency. She had watched him intervene one afternoon when a group of young men were making trouble for one of the Cherokee families near the edge of town, and he had done it without violence, without swagger, with a calm authority that had stopped the situation cold and left everyone, including the young men, with their dignity more or less intact. She had thought about that for a long time afterward. She had thought that a man who understood that human dignity was worth preserving even in confrontation was a man worth knowing. And then she had told herself firmly that she was not in the market for knowing any particular man in any particular way, because the last time she had trusted a man with the inside of herself it had gone very badly, and she had built her life in Harlan's Creek specifically to avoid that kind of pain again. But then he started bringing her mail, and she started making extra coffee in the mornings, and the walls she had spent years constructing turned out to be less solid than she had believed. The letters started arriving in April. The first one was from the marshal's office in Abilene, addressed to her in a formal hand, and she had opened it at the kitchen table with Thomas sitting across from her, and read it with her face going carefully, deliberately blank, because she had learned long ago that the best defense against being read was to become unreadable. She had refolded the letter and set it aside and finished her coffee and talked to Thomas about the coming school examination, and when he left she had sat alone for a long time. The letter was about her brother, Daniel Sawyer. It said that Daniel Sawyer, known also by 2 or 3 other names depending on the territory, was believed to be traveling west through Kansas. It said that he was wanted on charges of robbery and assault in Missouri and in the Indian Territory. It said that if she had any knowledge of his whereabouts or intentions, she was obligated to come forward. She had not seen Daniel in 4 years. She had not wanted to see him. He was the thing she had been fleeing when she came to Harlan's Creek, the dark past she did not discuss, the reason she had left Missouri with $2 and a trunk and a ferocious need to start over. She had written back to the marshal in Abilene and said she had no knowledge of her brother's whereabouts, which was the truth at that moment, and she had folded the matter away in the back of her mind and tried to leave it there. What she did not know, and would not know until months later when the whole thing collapsed around her like a burning barn, was that Thomas Redmond had read that letter. Not intentionally, not criminally. He had been given it by Gerald Finch that morning along with the other letters for her household, and it had not been properly sealed, the wax seal having come loose in transit, and he had opened it automatically, the way anyone might open an envelope that offered no resistance, and read several lines before he understood what he was holding and what he was doing. He had read enough to know that Cora Sawyer had a brother who was wanted and dangerous. He had read enough to know that this brother might be coming to Harlan's Creek. He had resealed the letter as best he could with a small piece of wax from the supply at Gerald Finch's store, and he had delivered it with the rest of her mail, and he had sat across from her at her kitchen table and watched her read it and watched her face go blank, and he had said nothing. This was the decision that would eventually break them open, though it would take months to do it, and in the meantime it would sit inside Thomas Redmond like a sliver of metal, small and sharp, and working its way deeper day by day. He had told himself it was a matter of law enforcement. He needed to be aware of potential threats to the town. He needed to know if a wanted man was likely to come through Harlan's Creek, because it was his job to keep the peace and protect the people. He told himself that telling Cora what he knew would only frighten her, and that it was better to handle it quietly through official channels. He had written to the marshal in Abilene directly and established a correspondence, asking to be kept informed of Daniel Sawyer's movements. He had increased his patrols on the eastern road without Cora knowing why. He had been, in his own estimation, doing exactly what a responsible deputy should do. What he had not done was tell Cora. And every morning that he did not tell her, the sliver worked a little deeper, because he had begun to understand, somewhere around the 3rd week of morning coffee and honest conversation, that what he was doing was not entirely about law enforcement. What he was doing was protecting himself as much as he was protecting her. Because if he told her about the letter, he would have to admit he had read it, and if he admitted he had read it, she might stop letting him bring her mail. And if she stopped letting him bring her mail, he would lose these mornings, which had become, without any particular announcement or warning, the most important part of his life. He was, in short, protecting something he did not have the right to protect, using means he did not entirely have the right to use, because he was falling in love with a woman who did not know it and had not consented to the danger it was putting her in. He understood this about himself. He was an honest man, and honest men eventually tell themselves the truth even when the truth is uncomfortable. He told himself the truth on a Friday evening in May, sitting on the step of the sheriff's office watching the sunset paint the Kansas sky in colors that had no business being as beautiful as they were. And he thought, "You are in love with Cora Sawyer, and you are keeping secrets from her, and both of these things are going to end badly if you do not do something about them." He had intended to tell her. He had made this intention into a firm resolution, the kind he had kept all his life on matters of law and duty. He had resolved that the next morning he would tell her what he knew about her brother, and he would tell her that he had read her letter, and he would accept whatever consequences came from that. The next morning he rode east on the Golden Road with her letters in his hand, and his resolution hardening into something he could hold on to, and he came up the path to her porch and found her there, sitting in the rocking chair she had placed near the door, with a book in her lap and the early light in her hair, and she looked up at him and smiled. It was the same smile he had first seen her give to the mud-dropped letters back in March. The private, unguarded smile that she gave only when she was not expecting to be observed, except she was observing him now. She was smiling at him like that openly, knowing he was there. He handed her the letters and sat down on the top porch step and said, "I need to tell you something." And she had said, "I know you do," in a voice that was soft and complicated, and something in the way she said it made him think she was not talking about her brother at all. Something in the way she said it made him think she was talking about the same thing he had been thinking about on the sunset step the night before. "Cora," he said. "Thomas," she said, just his name, and it sounded different than it ever had before, like she was trying out the weight of it. He looked at her for a long time, and she looked at him, and the morning moved around them, and he did not say anything about the letter or her brother. He said, "I find that I look forward to these mornings considerably." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I put the coffee on at 5 now, in case you were wondering why it's always ready when you get here." This was the closest either of them had come to saying it directly, and they both understood it perfectly, and neither of them said anything more about it. He stayed longer than usual that morning. They talked about books. She had been reading extensively, as she always did, and she wanted to know what he thought about Frederick Douglass's recent speeches, and he had opinions, and they argued companionably and then laughed at themselves for arguing, and the morning went long and gold and warm, and he rode back to town with the resolution still in his pocket, unspoken and increasingly guilty. The second letter came from Abilene in June. This one was properly sealed, and he did not open it, because he had told himself he would not do that again. He delivered it intact. But the marshal in Abilene also sent a wire to the sheriff's office, and Thomas read that because it came to him directly. The wire said that Daniel Sawyer had been spotted in the Indian Territory, moving north. It said to be watchful. Thomas told Sheriff Cal Briggs that there was a wanted man potentially moving toward Harlan's Creek, and Briggs said, "Good to know, son. Keep an eye out." And that was the extent of the official response, because Briggs was old and slow and had a lot on his plate, and one wanted man moving through the territory was not, in his estimation, a crisis. Thomas kept a closer eye out. He kept patrolling the eastern road. He kept bringing Cora her mail and drinking her coffee and talking to her about books and teaching and the slow renovation of the town's water system and the political situation back east. He kept not telling her. By July, the mornings had acquired a kind of domestic gravity that he felt in his whole body. He arrived at her porch at the same time every morning, and she was always there or opening the door before he could knock, and they sat with their coffee in the early cool of the day before the heat came up. And they talked, and sometimes they did not talk but sat companionably in the morning sounds, which was better. One morning in late July, she showed him the vegetable patch behind the house and explained how she managed the irrigation from the creek, using a small system of shallow trenches she had dug herself. And she was proud of it, rightly so, and he crouched beside the garden looking at her engineering with genuine admiration, and she was standing close beside him explaining the angle of the trenches. And when he straightened up, She was very near, and the morning light was in her eyes, which were dark brown and complicated, and looking directly at him. He reached up slowly, giving her every opportunity to step away, and moved a strand of hair back from her face, and she went very still, and he let his hand drop, and she breathed out slowly. "Thomas," she said. "I know," he said. "I have reasons," she said, "for being careful." "I know that too," he said. "I'm not asking you to stop being careful." She looked at him steadily. "What are you asking?" He considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "I'm asking you to keep letting me bring your mail," he said at last. It was not quite what he meant. She knew it was not quite what he meant. But she nodded once, and they went back inside and finished their coffee, and nothing more was said about it directly. But something had shifted between them, like a door opening into a room that had been closed a long time. August brought the heat in waves that made the air shimmer above the road and turned the grass on the plains to a pale gold that was beautiful and a little desperate. The town moved slower in the heat. People were shorter-tempered and kinder in turns, the way people get when the physical world is making demands on them. Cora's students were out of school for the summer, which meant she had more time, and the mornings stretched longer. Thomas stayed later. They walked the eastern road sometimes in the early morning when the temperature was still bearable, talking the way people talk when they are testing the weight of each other's thoughts, finding what they can support. She told him a little, on one of those walks, about Missouri. Not everything, not the hard specific things, but the outline of it. A father who had been domineering and frequently cruel, a brother who had chosen to follow that pattern in adulthood, a mother who had been overwhelmed and powerless. She had left when she was 22, and she had not gone back, and the life she had made in Harlan's Creek was built specifically on the conviction that she would never again be in a position of dependence or danger. He listened to all of this without interrupting, which she later told him was the thing she had most needed from a listener at that moment, because most people interrupted with sympathy or advice when what she needed was to be heard. He said, when she was done, "You built something real here. What you did takes a particular kind of courage." She looked at him sideways. "Most people would say it takes a particular kind of stubbornness." "Those are the same thing dressed different," he said. She laughed, and it was the laugh he liked best, the surprised one, the one that came out before she could arrange her face around it. He told her something that day, too, about Dodge City, about the things he had seen there, and the thing he had done that still sat heavy in him sometimes at night. He had shot a man in the line of duty, which was not unusual in frontier law enforcement, but the man had been young, barely 20, and had been in a bad situation largely of someone else's making, and Thomas had never entirely made peace with it the way he was supposed to. He had transferred to Harlan's Creek partly to get away from the memory of it. She listened to him the same way he had listened to her, without interrupting, and when he was done she said, "That sounds like someone carrying a weight that doesn't entirely belong to him." He was quiet for a moment. "That's a generous interpretation." "It's an accurate one," she said firmly. And that was all, but something about the firmness of it, the refusal to let him carry more than his share, loosened something in his chest that had been tight for 2 years. They walked back to her house in the early morning quiet, and he left for his patrol, and he thought about the weight of things all day, which things belong to you and which things you pick up and carry that were never yours, and whether any of that logic applied to the secret he had been carrying about her brother. He knew it did. He could not make it not apply. He tried, with increasing desperation through August and into September, to construct an argument by which his silence was acceptable, and every time the argument collapsed under its own dishonesty, because Thomas Redmond was constitutionally incapable of sustained self-deception, even when self-deception would have been much more comfortable. He was going to tell her. He was going to tell her before the month was out. He renewed this resolution on September 1st and told himself this time it was iron. What happened instead was that September 3rd brought Daniel Sawyer to Harlan's Creek. He came in on the afternoon stage, which did not usually stop in Harlan's Creek, but had a passenger with enough money to make it worth the detour. He was a lean man in his mid-30s with Cora's dark eyes and a mouth set in a harder line than hers, and he booked a room at the Creek Hotel and ate supper at the saloon without drawing much attention to himself, because he had long practice at not drawing attention. Thomas Redmond did not know he was there until the following morning, when he was at Gerald Finch's store collecting Cora's mail, and Gerald said, casually, "Miss Sawyer's got family in town. Her brother came in on yesterday's stage." Thomas went cold from the inside out. He put Cora's letters in his pocket and walked out of Gerald Finch's store and stood in the street for 30 seconds, calculating. Then he walked directly to the Creek Hotel. He found Daniel Sawyer at the hotel dining room eating breakfast with the relaxed confidence of a man who did not expect to be recognized, and he sat down across from him and said, quietly, "I know who you are and what you're wanted for. I'm going to give you one opportunity. You're going to finish your breakfast, get your things, and take the next stage out of this town. You are not going to go to see your sister." Daniel Sawyer looked at him with eyes that were Cora's eyes but colder and said, "And if I don't?" "Then I arrest you and wire Abilene, and you spend the next several years in federal custody," Thomas said. "And your sister learns you were here and why, and you lose any chance you might have had of fixing what's between you." It was a calculated gamble, implying there was something fixable, implying Daniel Sawyer might care about that. He read the man's face closely while he said it, looking for the leverage. He found it. There was something in Daniel Sawyer's face when his sister was mentioned, something complicated and ashamed that was buried under all the harder things but was still there. Daniel finished his breakfast. He went upstairs and got his bag. He got on the noon stage heading south. Thomas Redmond watched the stage go, and then he stood in the street in the September heat and felt the full weight of what he had just done and what he had failed to do. He had protected Cora. He was certain of that. He had kept a dangerous and possibly violent man away from her without forcing her to face that confrontation, which would have been painful and frightening. But he had also made a choice for her. He had decided what she needed and acted on it without consulting her, which was different from protecting someone, and had its own particular kind of dishonesty inside it. He had also, in the process of removing her brother from the situation, lost his last possible reason to wait before telling her the truth. There was no longer any law enforcement justification for keeping the secret. There was only the fact that telling her was going to be hard. He went to get her mail. He rode east on the morning road. She was on the porch, having slept in and still in her wrapper, a light cotton thing she wore on warm mornings, and she had her coffee, and she was looking at the sunrise with a peace on her face that he was about to disturb, and he stood at the bottom of the porch steps and said, "Cora, I need to tell you something. I've been needing to tell you for a long time." He told her about reading the first letter. He told her about the correspondence with the marshal in Abilene. He told her about Daniel arriving on the stage, and what he had done about it, and what had passed between them. He told her all of it in order, in the flat, honest voice he used when he was required to state facts he would rather not state. She listened with the blank face she put on when she was working very hard to contain something large. When he was finished, she looked at him for a long moment, and then she said, in a voice that was very quiet, "You read my letter." "Yes." "And you kept it from me for months." "Yes." "All this time you've been coming here every morning." She stopped. The blank face cracked, and beneath it was something raw and furious and hurt. "You made a decision about my life, Thomas, about something involving my family, which is my darkest thing, my most private thing, and you decided what I should know and when I should know it and what should be done about it without asking me." "I know," he said. "You don't get to do that," she said. "That is not protection. That is control, and I left Missouri to get away from that." The comparison landed like a physical blow, and he accepted it because it was not entirely wrong and he knew it. "You're right," he said. She went inside. She shut the door. The letter she had been holding fell to the porch boards. Thomas stood at the bottom of her steps for a long time. Then he got on his horse and rode back to town, and the road that had felt like something worth looking forward to for 6 months felt like everything else in his life had felt before, just something to be gotten through. The town felt the absence of those mornings in a way Thomas had not expected, though of course the town did not know about the mornings. Only he knew about the mornings. What he meant was that he felt the absence everywhere he went, because Harlan's Creek was not large and there was nowhere in it where the possibility of running into Cora Sawyer was entirely absent. He gave her space, because she needed it, and because he owed her that much. He did not ride the eastern road. He adjusted his patrol to avoid her house, which required a conscious and daily act of will that he performed without complaint, because he had made a mess, and the least he could do was not make it worse by hovering. He told himself that he had done what he had to do and that the rest was out of his hands. He did his job. He kept the peace. He ate his solitary suppers in the back room of the sheriff's office and sat on the step in the evenings and watched the sunset and did not allow himself to examine how empty the town felt without the weight of those morning hours. Sheriff Briggs, who was old but not unobservant, said to him one afternoon, "You look like a man who swallowed something disagreeable." "I made an error in judgment," Thomas said. "The kind that can be fixed or the other kind." Thomas considered this. "I don't know yet." Briggs was quiet for a moment, then said, "In my experience, most things of value in this life require a person to ask forgiveness at least once and usually more." Thomas filed this away. Cora, for her part, was working through something that was not as simple as anger, though the anger was real and she let herself feel it fully, because she had learned not to stuff feelings down where they could not be examined. She was angry at the betrayal, angry at the hidden motive, angry at the way the thing she had trusted had turned out to be more complicated than it looked. But she was also, in the honest part of herself that she could not turn off even when she would have liked to, working through other things. She thought about her brother. She had not known he was coming. If she had known, she would have been afraid, and rightfully so, because Daniel at his worst was a man who made bad situations worse, and who had never in his life accepted a boundary she set without testing it. Thomas had removed him without her having to face that confrontation, and while she was furious at the way it had been done, she could not pretend, honestly, that the outcome itself was anything but a relief. She thought about the mornings. She thought about what they had been, the way they had accumulated into something she had not had before, a daily proof that someone was thinking of her, that she was worth the detour. She thought about the way Thomas had listened to her talk about Missouri, and then said it takes a particular kind of courage, and how different that had felt from every other response she had gotten to her story over the years. She thought about the garden. She thought about the strand of hair and the careful way he had reached up and moved it, giving her every opportunity to step away. She was furious at him. She also missed him. These two things were both completely true at the same time, and she had enough experience with her own interior life to know that when two contradictory things are both completely true, you have not yet found the real thing underneath them. The real thing, when she finally got to it, on a cool evening in early October sitting on her porch in the dark, was this: she was afraid. She was afraid of needing someone again. She was afraid of the particular vulnerability of having let someone see the inside of her, the Missouri part, the brother part, the part she protected most fiercely, and then discovering that they had kept a secret about it. She was afraid that if she allowed herself to fully acknowledge what those mornings had meant to her, she would have to also acknowledge how much their loss was costing her, and acknowledging costs was the same as acknowledging need, and needing people was where she had always gotten hurt. She sat with this for a long time in the cool October dark and the prairie sounds, and then she went inside and wrote a letter to her brother. She did not have his address. She addressed it to the General Post Office in Abilene, with a request that it be forwarded if he came through, which she doubted would work, but which she felt compelled to attempt. The letter said that she had heard he had come to Harlan's Creek and been persuaded to leave without seeing her. It said that she had spent 4 years being angry at him, and that she did not think she could stop being angry, but that she was willing to begin a correspondence if he wanted one, because she had decided that carrying 4 years of anger was costing her something she could not afford, and she was setting some of it down. It said that if he ever truly changed, she was willing to consider what that might mean. It said that she was not willing to be in physical proximity to him yet, but a letter was different from a visit. It was not forgiveness. It was not reconciliation. It was a door open a crack to let some air in, because she had decided that closed things suffocate. She mailed the letter, and then she thought about doors open a crack to let some air in, and she thought about Thomas Redmond, and she made a decision. She put her coat on and walked into town. It was late enough that Main Street was quiet, just the saloon making its usual sounds and the lamp in the sheriff's office throwing a yellow rectangle into the street. She knocked on the door of the sheriff's office. Thomas opened it in his shirt sleeves with the look of a man who had not been expecting company and was working hard to organize his face into something that did not reveal what the sight of her was doing to him. "I need to say some things," Cora said. "Come in," he said. She came in. She sat in the chair across from his desk, and he sat behind it, and the lamp between them was steady and warm. "I'm still angry," she said first. "I want to be clear about that. What you did was a betrayal of trust, and I am not in the business of pretending that is something other than what it is." "I know," he said. "I don't want you to pretend that. But I have also been thinking," she said, "about the fact that you have been riding out to my house every morning since March, that my house is not on your route and has never been on your route, and that you have never once asked for anything in return for that. You kept doing it when you could have stopped. You kept coming back." He was very still. "And I have been thinking," she continued, "about the fact that when you found out about my brother, your first impulse was not to use it or to distance yourself from it. Your first impulse was to handle it and to keep me safe, even if the way you handled it was wrong. And I have been thinking about the fact that the way you listened to me when I told you about Missouri was different from any listening I have ever experienced, and I don't think you faked that." "I didn't," he said. "I know you didn't," she said. "That's the problem. If you had faked it, this would be much simpler." She folded her hands in her lap. "What I need to know is whether you understand what you did wrong, not the surface of it, the real thing underneath." He was quiet for a moment, and she gave him the quiet because she had noticed that he thought before he spoke, which was rare and valuable. "I made a decision about your life because I was afraid of losing what we had started," he said. "I told myself it was about your safety, and some part of it genuinely was, but the larger part was that I was protecting myself. I was protecting access to those mornings, and I dressed it up in law enforcement reasoning so I didn't have to look at it directly." He paused. "And I compared poorly to the men who hurt you, and I am sorry for that comparison because even if my intentions were different, the shape of what I did had the same outline." She looked at him for a long time. "That is a complete answer," she said finally. "It's the honest one." "I know." She stood up. "I'm not ready to be where we were," she said. "I need time to rebuild what got damaged." "I'll wait," he said. It came out immediately without calculation, which was why she believed it. She nodded once and walked to the door and then turned back. "I would like it," she said carefully, "if you brought my mail again. You don't have to, but I would like it." He looked at her steadily. "I'll be there at 6, he said. He was there at 6 the next morning. There was no dramatic scene. She opened the door and he handed her the letters and she said, "Coffee's made." And he came in and sat at her kitchen table, and they talked about the school examination results she had just received from the county, and the conversation was careful and gentle and had in it the feeling of two people walking on new ice, testing each step. But he was there. That was the thing. He was there. The weeks that followed were a kind of rebuilding that neither of them discussed explicitly because neither of them was a person who narrated their own processes out loud. They simply continued. Morning after morning he brought her mail. Morning after morning she made coffee. Morning after morning they talked, and the talk found its footing again, carefully first and then less carefully, until by November it had the old warmth back plus something new that was harder to name, something that had come through the fire of what had happened between them and come out on the other side more solid than before. She told him in November about the letter she had written to her brother. He listened without surprise. "Do you think he'll write back?" Thomas asked. "I don't know," she said. "Maybe not. But it needed doing for my own sake, not his." "That makes sense," he said. "Carrying things costs." She looked at him. "You said something like that before. About the weight and what belongs to you." "I remember." She was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about what belongs to me in this," she said. "What I want to claim and what I want to set down." He waited. "I don't want to set down these mornings," she said. "I want to claim them." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the November wind was moving through the bare branches of the cottonwood she had planted beside the house 2 years ago, and the sound of it was a kind of companionable presence. "Cora," he said, and his voice had something in it she had not heard there before, something careful and large. "I'm not saying I'm not still careful," she said quickly. "I am. I'm going to be careful for a long time probably, but I am saying that I am choosing this. I'm choosing it with my eyes open, knowing that you are not perfect and that I am not perfect and that things will go wrong again because that is the nature of people. I am choosing it anyway." He reached across the kitchen table and put his hand over hers, and she turned her hand over and held onto it, and that was that. There was no speech about it. There did not need to be. What followed was a winter, and it was the kind of winter that happens in small frontier towns that are isolated and cold and thrown back on their own resources, and it was the best winter of either of their lives. They were not reckless about it. The town needed to be managed carefully, because a schoolteacher's reputation was a practical matter and not just a personal one, and they were both old enough to understand that social reality without resenting it too much. He did not stop bringing her mail, and the town noticed and drew its own conclusions. And most of the conclusions were benign because most people in Harlan's Creek were aware that Thomas Redmond was a decent man and Cora Sawyer was a decent woman, and decent people finding each other was a cause for general goodwill. He proposed to her in February of 1882, on a Sunday morning after church, standing on her porch in the cold with his hat in his hands and no ring because he had not known whether she was ready and had not wanted to presume. She said, "Thomas Redmond, you have been bringing my mail every morning for nearly a year. You are not, at this stage, presuming." He had a ring by the following Sunday, a simple gold band from the jeweler in the county seat who had to be reached by telegraph, and who sent the ring on the supply wagon, and Cora wore it from the moment it arrived, which was on a Tuesday morning, delivered, as it happened, with her regular mail. They were married in April of 1882, 1 year after he had first collected her fallen letters from the mud at the gate. The ceremony was at the small Methodist church on 2nd Street, and it was attended by most of the town, because most of the town was invested in the outcome by that point, and also because the widow Haverson had been talking about it since February and had created a general atmosphere of anticipation. The Cherokee family that Cora had always been particular to include at school events sent 2 of their women with a wedding gift of beadwork that Cora hung in her parlor and looked at every day with something that was pride and gratitude together. Thomas had arrested the men who had troubled them and made sure the matter was handled properly, and this had not been forgotten by people who knew what it was to have their dignity treated carelessly. Sheriff Briggs said at the reception, which was held in the general store because it was the largest indoor space available, that Thomas was the best deputy he had ever worked with, and that he was sorry he was going to be distracted now that he had something worth being distracted by. And Thomas said he would manage, and Cora laughed and took his hand. They moved into her house on the Eastern Road because it was hers and she had built it, and he was a man who understood that. He repaired the shutter on the east-facing window that had needed a new pin since March of the previous year. She extended the kitchen garden to accommodate 2 people's worth of growing things. He built a second porch chair so they could both sit in the afternoon sun, which they did, most evenings in the warm months, talking or not talking in equal measure. He continued to serve as deputy, and she continued to teach, and life in Harlan's Creek moved through its seasons with the particular texture of frontier life in the 1880s, which was sometimes hard and sometimes beautiful, and usually both at once. In the summer of 1882, she received a letter from Daniel. It had taken 9 months, which was not surprising. It was not a long letter, and it was not an easy one to read, but it was honest in the way that letters from people who have made genuine effort are honest, without excuses, but also without the false modesty of excessive self-flagellation. He said he had been in Texas. He said he had stayed out of trouble for 6 months, which was the longest he had managed. He said he did not expect her to forgive him, but that her letter had mattered to him more than she probably knew. She wrote back. She told Thomas about it, reading him the relevant parts at the kitchen table over morning coffee, which was still their best time, still the hour that belonged particularly to them. "Do you think he'll keep straight?" Thomas asked. "I don't know," she said, "but the trying matters. I think the trying matters even when it doesn't fully work." He looked at her across the table with the expression she had come to associate with moments when he was feeling something too large for the words he usually used. "You're a generous person," he said. "I'm a practical one," she said, "but thank you." He reached across and tucked that same strand of hair back from her face, the one that always came loose, and she caught his hand and held it against her cheek for a moment, and neither of them said anything because they did not need to. In the fall of 1882, Cora discovered she was pregnant. She told Thomas on a Sunday morning in October, sitting on the porch in the autumn cool, and she watched his face go through several things very quickly before settling on something that was pure and unguarded and very bright. "Well," he said, which was not much, but the way he said it was everything. He was, throughout the whole of it, attentive without being anxious, which was exactly what she needed. He did not treat her as fragile. He did not make decisions for her about her own body or her own experience, having learned that lesson with considerable thoroughness the previous year. He asked what she needed and then provided it and then asked again, which is really all that good support is. She continued teaching until January, when the winter made the walk difficult and the county agreed to a temporary replacement. She spent the winter months in considerable discomfort and occasional terror, because childbirth in 1882 on the Kansas frontier was not a thing to approach without appropriate seriousness. But she was attended by the town's physician, Dr. Hartwell, who was competent and careful, and by the widow Haverson, who turned out to be an excellent practical nurse beneath all the gossip, and by Thomas, who stayed close without hovering. Their son was born on a February morning in 1883 in the room where they slept, delivered by Dr. Hartwell, while Thomas sat just outside the door because he had been told in no uncertain terms by both the widow Haverson and Cora herself that his presence inside the room was not necessary and also was not going to happen. He sat with his hands clasped and his elbows on his knees, and listened to the sounds from the room with an intensity of attention that was the most helpless he had ever felt in his life, including situations that had involved guns. The son cried his way into the February morning with a volume that suggested he had opinions about his arrival and intended to express them. And when Thomas was admitted to the room, he found Cora propped against the pillows, looking exhausted and fierce in the specific way of a woman who has accomplished something enormous, and she handed him the baby and said, "There he is." The baby was red and squinting and appeared on first impression to be conducting a thorough assessment of the world and finding it somewhat disappointing. Thomas held him very carefully and looked at him for a long time. "He has your nose," he said. "He has your ears," she said. "That's unfortunate for him," Thomas said. She laughed, which hurt, and he looked up at her with concern, and she waved it off and held out her arms for the baby, and he brought him back carefully and sat on the edge of the bed beside her. And they sat together in the February morning looking at this person they had made who was, despite his initial impressions of the world, already quieting. They named him James, which was Thomas's father's name, which was a thing Thomas had not asked for and had not expected. And when she told him that was what she wanted the baby called, he went quiet for a moment and then said, "Thank you," with a sincerity that was plain and unadorned. James Redmond grew through the spring and summer with the alarming speed that babies have, acquiring opinions and expressions, and eventually the ability to roll himself determinedly across the parlor floor toward whatever interested him most, which was generally the base of the lamp or his father's boots. Cora went back to teaching in the fall of 1883, and the county had held her position because she was the best teacher Harlan's Creek had managed to find, and everyone knew it. The widow Haverson, who had developed an unexpected fondness for baby James during the winter months, watched him in the mornings. This worked well enough that Cora could hear from the school the sound of the widow Haverson telling James, at considerable volume, her opinions about various subjects of local interest. Thomas continued his patrols. He continued to bring her mail, which had long since become official in the sense that the postal arrangement in Harlan's Creek had been renegotiated to include the eastern residential stretch, partly because Thomas had pointed out to Gerald Finch that it was absurd to have a route that excluded the most populated outlying street, and partly because Gerald Finch had looked at him and said, "You've been riding out there every morning for 2 years, Redmond. Might as well make it official," with the particular dry humor of a man who has been watching a situation develop for a long time and is pleased with how it came out. Daniel Sawyer wrote again in the spring of 1883. He was still in Texas. He had gotten work on a cattle operation and had been there 4 months, which was progress. He asked carefully whether the deputy she had mentioned marrying was a decent sort of man, and she wrote back and said he was, and then thought about that for a moment and added that he was the best sort of man she had encountered, which surprised her by being exactly what she meant. She told Thomas about this exchange, and he said, "Your brother has my sympathies. Building something new when you're carrying what he's carrying is not easy work." She looked at him. "You have a generous spirit," she said, "for a man who sent him away on a noon stage." "I have a practical one," he said, using her own words back at her, and she threw a dish towel at him and he caught it. In 1884, James learned to walk, which he did with the same decisive quality as everything else, standing up one morning in the kitchen with the particular look of someone who has made a decision and is not interested in further discussion, and walking across the kitchen floor to his father. Thomas caught him and held him up, and James appeared satisfied with the whole enterprise. It was also in 1884 that Sheriff Cal Briggs announced his retirement. He was 63, and his joints had been making their objections known for 2 years, and he said he had served as long as he was useful and longer than was comfortable, and he intended to spend his remaining years on a porch, which he did, immediately and with great dedication. The county appointed Thomas as acting sheriff pending a formal election in the fall, and the election was essentially a formality, because everyone in Harlan's Creek already thought of him as the authority, and the unofficial vote had been in his favor for approximately 3 years. He was elected sheriff of Harlan's Creek County in October of 1884 by a margin that suggested unanimity, and he stood in the street outside the polling location with his new badge in his hand and looked at it for a moment and then looked at Cora, who was standing a few feet away with James on her hip, and she looked back at him with the expression she used when she was trying not to look proud and was not succeeding. "Sheriff Redmond," she said. "Mrs. Redmond," he said. James, having no patience for formal exchanges, pointed at the badge and said "shiny," which was one of his current primary operating words, and Thomas put the badge in the boy's hand and James examined it with the thoroughness of a 2-year-old, and that was the celebration. In 1885, Cora became pregnant again. This time she was less frightened, which was not the same as not frightened but was better, doctor. Hartwell had delivered enough babies in the county now that his confidence was well established and genuinely merited, and the widow Haverson had appointed herself a permanent fixture of the household in a way that had somehow become welcome rather than intrusive, possibly because she had toned down the gossip considerably after James's birth and focused her considerable energy on being genuinely useful. The second child came in March of 1886, a daughter this time, whom they named Ruth after Cora's mother, which was a complicated choice given what Cora had said about her parents, but she explained it to Thomas by saying that her mother had been overwhelmed and powerless, not unkind, and that she wanted to give the name something new to mean. Ruth Redmond arrived with a calm that was the complete opposite of her brother's vocal debut, opening her eyes with a thoughtful expression that suggested she was already assessing the situation and finding it acceptable. Thomas held her in the lamplight of the bedroom and said, "She looks like you." "She looks like herself," Cora said. "Both can be true," he said. The spring of 1886 was a good one for Harlan's Creek. The railroad had reached the county line the previous year, which brought new business and new people and the usual complications that came with growth, but also resources the town had been doing without. A proper schoolhouse was built with 2 rooms, which meant Cora could hire an assistant teacher and expand the curriculum. Thomas hired 2 deputies to help with the expanded law enforcement requirements of a growing town, and he trained them with the same care that his marshal in Dodge City had trained him, emphasizing the prevention of harm over the performance of authority. Daniel Sawyer wrote again that spring. He had been with the cattle operation in Texas for 2.5 years, which was no longer progress in the cautious sense, but was beginning to look like something solid. He asked whether there was any possibility of meeting, not in Harlan's Creek, not to impose on what she had built there, but somewhere neutral if she was ever willing. She talked to Thomas about it for several evenings before she wrote back. It was a complicated calculation, the ongoing risk that Daniel might not have changed enough balanced against the cost of permanent distance, from the only family she had left balanced against the fact that she had 2 children now who had an uncle they had never met, and she was not sure that permanent estrangement was what she wanted for them going forward. Thomas said, as he usually did in these conversations, what he genuinely thought rather than what he thought she wanted to hear, which was that the man's record suggested genuine effort, but that genuine effort was not the same as genuine change, and she should be cautious. He also said that he would support whatever she decided, and that if she decided to meet Daniel and wanted Thomas present for it, he would be there. She wrote back to Daniel and said she would consider a meeting in Abilene on neutral ground when the children were old enough to be left with the widow Haverson for a few days. Daniel wrote back in a week, which was the fastest any letter had ever come from Texas, and said whenever she was ready. It was 2 more years before she felt ready. James was 5 and Ruth was 2, and both of them were manageable without both parents present for short periods, and the widow Haverson was essentially a grandmother by that point in all but name, and Thomas arranged his duties to allow the 2 days away. They took the stage to Abilene in the spring of 1888, Cora and Thomas together, and Cora met her brother for the first time in 9 years in the lobby of the hotel where they had all agreed to meet. Daniel Sawyer was lean and weathered, and there were new lines around his eyes and mouth that were not there in the family photograph Cora still had from before everything went wrong. He stood up when she came through the door, and he looked at her with his face doing several things at once, none of them the harder things she had been braced for, all of them something that looked, cautiously, like the same complicated shame that Thomas had once identified as the leverage point. Thomas shook his hand, which Cora watched with a particular attention. Daniel looked at Thomas Redmond, and Thomas Redmond looked at Daniel Sawyer, and some assessment passed between them in the frontier shorthand of men who have both done difficult things and know it, and then they sat down. The conversation was not easy. There was no version of this conversation that could have been easy, because there was too much history and too much hurt and too much time for the easy version to be available. But it was honest, and it progressed, haltingly, through the afternoon and into an evening supper that none of them had planned to extend to, but that seemed to require the time. Daniel apologized to Cora in language that was simple and did not make excuses and did not ask for anything from her in return, which was the only kind of apology she had been willing to accept, and she said she heard him, which was not forgiveness but was a beginning. He asked about the children, and she showed him the photographs she had brought, which she had brought deliberately, and he looked at James and Ruth for a long time with an expression that was the most human thing she had seen on his face since they were young. They parted the next morning with a handshake between Thomas and Daniel that had more in it than handshakes usually carry, and a brief embrace between Cora and her brother that was careful and tentative, and was the first physical contact they had had in nearly a decade, and which cost Cora something she was not entirely sure what to call but was glad to have paid. On the stage home to Harlan's Creek, Thomas held her hand and did not say anything for a long time, because he understood that she was working through something and she did not need him to manage it, only to be present in it. She leaned her head against his shoulder after a while, and he rested his cheek against the top of her head, and the Kansas landscape moved past the stage window in the spring light. "Well," she said, which was his word, which she used sometimes now because she had absorbed some of his particular language the way people who love each other absorb each other over time. "Well," he agreed. "I think that was the right thing," she said. "I think so too." She was quiet for a while. "Thank you for being there," she said. He turned his head enough to press his lips to her temple. "I told you I'd wait," he said. "That means being wherever you need me." She tightened her hand on his. Outside the window, the prairie was blooming with the early wildflowers that came in the Kansas spring before the summer dried everything out, and they were a mass of color across the flat land, improbable and brief and exactly enough. Back in Harlan's Creek, James had been a model of cooperation for the widow Haverson for approximately the first day, and had spent the second day in a pitched battle of wills with her over whether he was allowed to take his father's old patrol route by himself on the horse that was technically too large for a 5-year-old, which the widow Haverson had eventually resolved through negotiation of a kind she never fully explained. Ruth had been her usual placid self, applying herself to the serious business of toddlerhood with the methodical thoughtfulness that seemed to be her primary characteristic. The summer of 1888 was good. Harlan's Creek was growing into something that had permanence to it, a railroad stop with a real commercial district, and a school with 2 rooms and a sheriff's office with 3 full-time deputies, and a population that was acquiring institutions, a library organized by Cora and 2 other women from the Methodist Church, a medical office for Dr. Hartwell, who had previously operated out of his house, a courthouse that had been under construction since spring and was nearly finished. Thomas took James on his first proper ride-along patrol in June, which was not a real patrol but a gentle circuit of the eastern road at a slow walk on Thomas's horse with James sitting in front of him. And James treated the entire thing with the gravity of a professional, which made Thomas laugh more than he had in weeks. Cora watched them come back down the road from her kitchen garden, Thomas and James on the horse in the afternoon light, and she straightened up and pushed the dirt off her hands and watched them until they were through the gate, and she thought about the fact that she had come to Harlan's Creek 22 years old with $2 and no certainty about anything, and that the distance between that woman and this moment was almost too large to comprehend. She had built something. That was the thing she kept coming back to. She had built a life and a home and a family and a career and a friendship with a man that had become love, and all of it was hers, chosen and constructed with her own hands, and no part of it had been given to her. Thomas helped James down from the horse, and James ran immediately across the garden toward her, which he did every time they had been separated for more than an hour, and she caught him and lifted him, which was getting harder as he got heavier and would soon be impossible but was not impossible yet. "We rode all the way to the creek," James told her seriously. "Did you?" she said. "Father says I'm a good rider. Does he?" Thomas came up behind them and took her free hand and kissed her cheek, and James said "gross," with the conviction of a 5-year-old, and wriggled to be set down, and they let him go and he ran to find Ruth, who had been sitting near the kitchen garden watching the whole scene with the particular patience of a 2-year-old who has figured out that waiting usually produces interesting results. Thomas kept her hand, and they stood in the evening light together, looking at the 2 children crossing the garden in the long shadows, James directing, and Ruth following with the serene confidence of a person who knows they are going to get where they are going eventually. "I've been thinking," Thomas said. "What about?" "About the eastern porch," he said. "I think it needs a 3rd chair." She looked at him. "What for?" "James is getting old enough to sit up with us in the evenings," he said. "And in a year or 2 Ruth will want to as well. I thought we could make it bigger. Add a small table. Make it a place the whole family could use in the evenings." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the garden and the children and the cottonwood tree that was considerably larger now than when she had planted it. "That," she said, "is a very good idea." He squeezed her hand, and she leaned against him for a moment in the evening light, and it was not dramatic or extraordinary, just a moment in an ordinary evening of a life that had required extraordinary effort and care, and had arrived somewhere that was, she thought, approximately what the word home actually meant when you got it right. In the fall of 1888, the library opened in a room attached to the courthouse, with a collection of 212 volumes assembled through Cora's correspondence with publishers and benefactors, and a donation from the county that she had personally lobbied for in a letter to the county commissioners that Thomas still referred to as the most efficiently devastating document I have ever read, which she took as the high compliment it was intended to be. The opening was attended by most of the town, because Cora had organized it the same way she organized everything, with complete thoroughness and a particular gift for making people feel that what was happening was important and belonged to them. She stood at the front of the room in her good blue dress and talked about why books mattered in a frontier town, about how knowledge was not a luxury but a resource as practical as water, about how the children of Harlan's Creek deserved access to the same tools of understanding as children in any city. She was not a rousing speaker in the theatrical sense, but she was precise and convinced, and precision and conviction are often more persuasive than theater. Thomas stood at the back of the room and watched her with the expression he had when he was feeling something he was not going to put into words, which was fine, because the expression said it clearly enough. Daniel Sawyer visited Harlan's Creek for the first time in December of 1888, a careful and pre-negotiated visit that lasted 4 days and was conducted with the awareness that it was a provisional thing, subject to revision. He stayed at the Creek Hotel and came to dinner twice and met James and Ruth under conditions that were calm and supervised. James took to him immediately, because James took to most people immediately, a social ease that neither of his parents entirely shared, and that they attributed to some genetic lottery they were grateful for. Ruth observed him for 2 entire days before allowing him to hold her, which he accepted with patient good humor that suggested he had done some genuine work on his character. On his last evening, Daniel sat on the porch with Thomas while Cora put the children to bed, and they talked in the way that 2 men talk when they have both been shaped by difficulty and have both come out somewhere better than expected, but are not entirely sure of the terrain yet. Daniel said he was grateful for what Thomas had done, turning him away from that first visit, and Thomas said it was not something that needed gratitude, just something that had needed doing. Daniel said he understood that his sister had been lucky to find a man who understood where the line between protection and control actually ran, and Thomas said that he had not always understood it as well as he should, and had needed the lesson delivered clearly. Daniel left on the morning stage and waved from the window, and James waved back vigorously, and Ruth raised one hand with the composure of a person 3 times her age. Cora stood on the porch and watched the stage go and then looked at Thomas beside her. "Better than I feared," she said. "Better than it could have been," he said. "Better than some things deserve to be. That's the thing about better," she said. "It doesn't ask what it deserves. It just is, if you do the work." He put his arm around her and she leaned into it, and they stood there as the dust from the stage settled on the December street, and the cold was sharp, and the sky above Harlan's Creek was the particular blue of winter mornings, hard and clear and going on in all directions forever. In the spring of 1889, James started at the school. He was in his mother's classroom, which produced some initial diplomatic complications since he had strong opinions about the authority arrangement, and needed one very serious conversation with both his parents to understand that the classroom version of his mother was a separate and primary authority from the home version. After that conversation, which Thomas conducted with the straightforward gravity that he brought to all matters requiring clarity, James was an acceptable student, which meant he participated vigorously, argued sometimes but substantively, and turned in work that showed genuine effort. Ruth, at 3, was already demonstrating an interest in books that suggested she had absorbed her mother's library project through some form of proximity-based learning. She had opinions about which books should be read to her at bedtime, and expressed these opinions with quiet implacability until they were honored. Thomas kept the peace in Harlan's Creek through the late 1880s with the same steady approach that had characterized his whole tenure, preventing more than he resolved and resolving more than he forced. He had 2 good deputies now, both of whom he had trained carefully, and the town had grown into something stable enough that the daily emergencies of early frontier life were becoming less frequent, replaced by the different complications of a town trying to build permanent institutions. On a morning in May of 1889, 8 years after he had first found her letters in the mud at her gate, Thomas Redmond rode east on the morning road and came to the house that was now their house, though everyone still called it Cora's place, because that was what it had been first and names stick in small towns, and the cottonwood was full and green, and the kitchen garden was in its spring beginning, and Cora was on the porch with her coffee in the new chair. The larger porch configuration with the small table and the children's chairs that had been added 2 years ago. He tied his horse at the gate and came up the path and handed her her mail, which was a habit so old and established now that it was simply part of the fabric of their life, no different from breathing, no different from the morning itself. She took the letters and held them in one hand and held her coffee in the other, and looked at him climbing the porch steps in the morning light with the serious gray eyes, and the hat that needed replacing and the badge that caught the sun. And she felt the whole accumulated weight of the years between his first arrival at her gate and this morning. Every letter and every conversation and the betrayal and the rebuilding and the children and the library and Daniel and all of it. Everything that made up a life built by 2 people who had decided, one tentative step at a time, to build it together. "Coffee's made," she said. He sat down in the chair next to hers, and she poured him a cup from the pot she had brought out to the porch, because it was warm enough for that now, and she liked having it outside in the spring mornings. They sat in the early light with their coffee and the letters in her lap unread, and the sound of James from inside the house, which indicated he was up and having opinions about breakfast, and the smaller, quieter sound of Ruth, which indicated she was up and was making considered choices about her morning. Thomas looked out at the eastern road in the gold spring morning and then looked at Cora, who was watching him. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "I was just thinking." "About what?" She looked at him for a moment longer. "About the fact that you are not on this route," she said. "You have never been on this route. You have been coming to this porch every morning for 8 years as an act of pure and entirely unnecessary will." He looked back at her steadily. "I know that. I was going to say," she said, "that I hope you never stop." He reached over and took her hand where it lay on the arm of the chair, and she turned it over and held on to him, which was what she always did, had always done from the first time in the kitchen almost 7 years ago now, and it was still each time exactly right. "I won't," he said. "This is my route." Inside the house, James announced that he required pancakes, and Ruth, from somewhere near the bookshelf, made a request that was too quiet to hear from the porch but was clearly a request for something. And the morning moved around the small house on the eastern road in Harlan's Creek, Kansas, in the spring of 1889, with the cottonwood in full leaf and the garden beginning its annual green and the road gold in the early light. And the two of them sat in it together with their coffee and their morning and their life, which was ordinary and extraordinary in the particular way of things that are built with care, and kept with effort and chosen, freely, every single day. Thomas Redmond continued to bring Cora Sawyer her mail every morning for the rest of his working life, through his years as sheriff and into the quieter decades beyond, long after the route had been formally adjusted and long after it was his official duty, because it had never been about the duty and both of them had always known it. It had been about the choice, the daily, deliberate, unhesitating choice. And some choices, made with enough conviction, become simply the shape of who you are.